Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. There is a moment just before a thought forms when the air feels slightly different, as if the mind is preparing itself for something it cannot yet name. That moment used to be quiet. Now it carries a faint vibration, a sense of expectation that rises without an object. You pause, waiting for awareness to settle, but instead you feel a small forward pull, the kind that appears when a device is about to light up, even though nothing is there. The stillness is intact, yet it feels gently disturbed, as if attention is leaning toward a signal that has not arrived. This is not anxiety. It is something subtler, a soft pre-shaping of perception that enters before the thought has taken form. You notice it again while standing at a window. The world outside is unchanged, but the mind tilts slightly, preparing to receive rather than simply to see. Your eyes rest on a quiet street, yet a part of your attention hovers ahead of the moment, reaching for an interruption you cannot describe. Even your body participates. Your hand makes the slightest motion toward your pocket, a gesture too fast and too familiar to belong entirely to you. When you catch it, the surprise is mild but unmistakable. It feels as though the impulse originated somewhere between intention and habit, in a space you did not consciously authorize. The boundary between anticipation and perception bends in a way it did not before. It feels harmless, even natural, yet it carries a soft pressure. Thoughts do not seem to rise from inside so much as arrive from a direction just outside reach. A mood starts to form, but its origin feels slightly displaced, as if shaped by a rhythm you did not choose. You find yourself completing a sentence in your mind before you realize you never began it. None of this is disruptive, it is delicate, almost gentle, but it creates the sense that attention is no longer entirely your own. The narrator inside you takes a half step forward before you have invited it to speak. In the midst of this, the room around you begins to feel charged in a subtle way. Sounds sharpen, light thickens at the edges. A simple object holds your gaze with unusual weight, as if waiting for you to interpret it. You are not confused, you are attuned. Something in the way you listen has shifted. Experience seems to arrive already leaning toward explanation, already prepared to become something other than itself. You sense that a voice is forming just at the edge of perception, a voice close enough to be familiar, yet distant enough that you cannot claim it entirely as your own. We tell ourselves stories in order to live, but the narrating voice inside the mind no longer feels entirely self-made. A thought arrives with a rhythm that seems slightly unfamiliar, as if it were lifted from a cadence practiced somewhere outside awareness. A quiet phrase surfaces with the smoothness of something already rehearsed. Even the emotional tone of a passing idea carries the faint imprint of patterns encountered earlier in the day. This does not feel like intrusion, it feels like drift. The inner narrator begins to lean toward the shape of what it has absorbed, repeating fragments not because they were chosen, but because they were available. The line between thinking and being prompted softens until it becomes difficult to locate where intention begins. The shift reveals itself in the body before it appears in language. Standing at a crossing, the mind reaches for a thought with the same quick, twitch-like expectation that accompanies the gesture of checking a device. Waking before dawn, there is a brief moment when the mind feels slightly out of sync, as if a thought has arrived one beat too early. Sitting alone at a table, a mood rises and falls with a pacing that resembles the rhythm of scrolling, a series of abrupt transitions rather than a continuous flow. These moments are small, but they accumulate. They leave the impression of an internal monologue shaped by fragments stitched together faster than reflection can stabilize them. The emotional consequence is quiet but persistent. A person begins to sense that their reactions feel preloaded, as if the thought has formed just before the experience that should have produced it. A slight lag or acceleration creates a subtle unease. The voice inside seems to be anticipating instead of witnessing. This produces a soft erosion of trust in one's own interpretations. When thoughts arrive in a tone that feels borrowed, the self hesitates. It becomes harder to distinguish between what emerges from attention and what has been patterned by repetition. The narrator begins to sound like a blend of external cues and private memory, neither entirely independent nor entirely guided. The ethical stakes of this condition are significant. When the inner voice adopts the pacing and structure of systems designed to predict behavior, autonomy becomes less about choosing and more about selecting from a narrow set of prefigured impulses. The mind starts to follow grooves carved by exposure rather than perception. This changes how judgment forms. It narrows the range of interpretations a person can generate without noticing the constraint. Yet a point of clarity remains. When the narrator feels too ready, too smooth, too patterned, attention can pause long enough to sense the seam where influence ends. In that pause, thought slows to the pace of experience and the narrator begins to sound like itself again. The hearth once created a quiet gravitational field that gathered people into a single moment of shared attention. A room filled with the same sound and light provided a common frame through which events could be interpreted. Even when the broadcast was flawed, its unity supplied a sense of synchrony that made conversation possible. The shift to the phone broke that synchrony. Reality no longer enters through a collective doorway. It arrives through individualized streams that speak to one person at a time, each calibrated to private habits and vulnerabilities. What once anchored meaning now disperses it. The room remains, but the shared world dissolves. This fragmentation becomes visible in ordinary scenes. Two people sit side by side on a sofa, each absorbed in a different flow of images and claims. One sees a story of crisis. The other sees a moment of triumph. Their bodies share a space, but their attention inhabits different emotional climates. When they finally look up, the dissonance lingers between them, subtle but undeniable. The conversation that follows begins slightly off balance. A simple question, asked in good faith, can feel strangely loaded because each person assumes a different background world. The room no longer provides a common horizon. It holds multiple overlapping realities that must be translated before understanding can form. The phenomenology of this split reveals itself in moments that once held communal texture. Waiting rooms, bus rides, and queues used to generate fleeting social bonds through shared boredom or quiet observation. Now each person retreats into a private portal where meaning is delivered in bursts tailored to their own patterns. The tiny social signals that once made strangers legible to each other begin to fade. Without them, people appear harder to read, harder to approach, harder to situate within a shared field of understanding. The social fabric loses the micro-recognitions that once softened public life. In their absence, the world feels more fragmented than the architecture around it suggests. The ethical consequences deepen this fracture. Shared reality is not only a cultural artifact, it is the basis on which trust is formed, decisions are coordinated, and collective problems become visible. When each person experiences a different narrative about what matters, the idea of a common problem becomes fragile. Disagreement becomes harder to navigate because the disagreement does not begin from the same foundation. A person may interpret a comment as harmless while another hears it as evidence of an entirely different world. This creates a subtle distance in relationships that were once effortless. It also weakens the ability of communities to act together, since action requires agreement about what is happening at all. Yet the possibility of shared reality is not lost. It shifts from something given to something created. When two people put the device aside and attend to the same moment, however small, coherence begins to form again. A gesture, a sentence, a pause long enough for perception to align. The hearth no longer arrives automatically. It appears whenever attention is offered to the same point in the world. We move through life guided by scripts written for a world that no longer exists, yet the body follows them with the ease of muscle memory. The idea that adulthood unfolds in a predictable sequence remains lodged in expectation, even as the structures that once supported that sequence have eroded. The script whispers that hard work secures that loyalty earns advancement, that tomorrow will resemble today in shape and promise. But reality now arrives in abrupt shifts, irregular openings and sudden closures. The mismatch creates a faint internal wobble, a feeling that life should be making sense in a way it no longer does. The ghost script does not simply mislead, it distorts orientation. This distortion becomes clearest in small, almost private moments. Sitting at a desk late in the evening, a person reaches for the hope that persistence will unlock an opportunity that the current economy no longer produces. Opening an inbox, the body anticipates a message as if following an old rule where diligence leads to reward. Walking past a real estate listing, the mind momentarily imagines a future built on assumptions carried forward from another era. These gestures have the shape of meaning, but the meaning has drifted. They enact a world that has already ended. The script moves smoothly while the terrain beneath it has shifted. The emotional texture of this mismatch is not simple disappointment. It is a kind of suspended mourning, a grief for a future once assumed so completely that its absence feels like a private failure. The ache appears in quiet moments, often without name. A person may wake with a heaviness that does not correspond to any event, only to the sense that the timeline they were taught to trust has dissolved. This produces a subtle confusion. Expectations feel anachronistic. Decisions feel strangely weightless, as if made inside a narrative that no longer corresponds to the material world. The self tries to adjust, but the adjustments remain tethered to an old architecture of promise. The ethical stakes of this condition extend beyond emotion. Ghost scripts isolate individuals by making structural shifts appear as personal shortcomings. They encourage people to measure themselves against criteria that have lost their grounding. They obscure the forces shaping instability, replacing collective pressure with private self-doubt. This has political consequences. When people blame themselves for systemic failures, solidarity weakens, recognition thins, shared interests become harder to perceive. The ghost script fractures not only internal alignment, but the potential for collective understanding. Yet within this disorientation lies a quiet form of clarity. When the script's authority weakens, attention begins to shift from inherited narratives to the actual contours of the present. People start to notice what is real rather than what was promised. Agency re-emerges not as control over a predetermined future, but as the capacity to respond honestly to the conditions at hand. This agency is quieter, humbler, more immediate. It replaces the myth of the stable arc with a more grounded form of meaning. In that shift, the ghost script loosens and the world becomes available again on its own terms. Collapse reaches us first as spectacle, shaped into the cadence of entertainment, before it ever touches the ground we stand on. The stream frames disaster with the pacing of suspense, the rhythm of scenes arranged to hold attention. A wildfire flickers like a cinematic reveal. A financial shock reads as a plot twist. A political rupture is delivered with the tone of a season turning. The interface teaches the mind to expect catastrophe to follow the logic of story rather than the logic of cause and effect. This translation is not neutral. It reshapes how danger is recognized, how urgency is felt, and how reality is allowed to register. The distortion becomes vivid in small, revealing moments. A person watches footage of rising floodwater with the same mild anticipation that accompanies a cliffhanger. The body leans forward not in fear, but in narrative expectation. Only when the water appears on their own street does the emotional register shift from scene to consequence. Even then, a lingering hesitation remains, as if the mind is waiting for the next beat in a storyline instead of responding to the physical threat. A similar pattern emerges in public life. A crisis unfolds outside, but the stream supplies so many competing narratives that each event feels provisional, awaiting its proper framing. Action stalls because the story has not yet told people what it means. The phenomenology of this condition is unsettling. A breaking alert triggers a spike of attention that collapses instantly, leaving behind a thin residue of unease. A moment of genuine danger feels curiously muffled, softened by the expectation that it will soon resolve into the next update. People scroll past distressing scenes with the same gesture used for humour, the body unable to recalibrate between incompatible emotional registers at the speed demanded of it. This mismatch blurs the boundary between fiction and impact. The mind begins to treat lived experience as another entry in an endless narrative stream, flattening the urgency that should anchor response. The ethical cost is profound. When collapse is consumed through genre, the instinct to act deteriorates. Spectatorship replaces participation. The performance of crisis becomes more compelling than its material consequences. Systems benefit from this detachment. They can fail publicly without provoking the level of engagement that rupture requires. The spectacle of disaster dilutes the discomfort that might otherwise drive solidarity or intervention. People feel informed but powerless, attentive but uninvolved. The story is satisfying enough to replace the difficult work that reality demands. Yet within this distortion lies a moment of clarity. The narrative frame falters when the world refuses to behave like a plot. Events do not build toward a reveal. Consequences accumulate without climax. The expected turn never arrives. This resistance exposes the limits of genre as a way of understanding the world. It returns attention to the unframed real, where danger does not need a storyline to matter. In this recognition, the mind steps briefly outside the spectacle. It sees collapse not as a sequence to follow, but as a condition that requires contact rather than consumption. You are taught to imagine yourself as a character moving through a story, but the systems surrounding you no longer read you this way. They register you as a pattern, a cluster of probabilities, a sequence of signals that can be sorted, categorized and predicted. The inner sense of being a continuous self begins to rub against the external fact of being interpreted as data. This tension produces a quiet estrangement. You try to live as a narrative, but the world responds to you as a profile. The discrepancy does not announce itself loudly. It reveals itself in subtle shifts that accumulate in the fabric of daily life. You feel it in the instant before a suggestion appears on a screen, when the mind experiences a faint tug of anticipation, as though a preference has been recognized before it has fully formed. You sense it when a recommendation aligns too closely with a thought that has barely surfaced, creating a momentary confusion about whether the desire preceded the prompt or the prompt preceded the desire. Even the body reacts. A slight tightening in the chest when an advertisement echoes a private worry. A small jolt of recognition when a phrase mirrors something you said aloud only once. These moments are brief, but each one presses against the boundary between being seen and being scanned. The emotional consequence of this condition is subtle but cumulative. A person begins to question the authenticity of their own preferences. A choice that once felt personal now carries the shadow of suggestion. The self hesitates. It wonders whether an impulse arises from lived experience or from being repeatedly nudged toward a predictable pattern. This uncertainty creates a faint sense of displacement. The narrative of the self feels crowded. Thoughts that once arrived organically now appear in a texture shaped by external rhythms. The boundary between intention and influence becomes difficult to locate. The ethical stakes deepen the tension. When systems learn a person's patterns more quickly than the person learns their own, the path of least resistance becomes increasingly predetermined. The self becomes legible not through inner reflection, but through statistical inference. This alters how autonomy is exercised. Decisions become constrained by what the system anticipates, and what the system anticipates shapes what feels available to choose. Over time, the range of possible futures tightens. Not through coercion, but through the quiet gravitational pull of prediction. The self is not forced into a profile, it grows into one. Yet within this estrangement lies a narrow but significant opening. The moment of discomfort that arises when a system appears to know too much is also a moment of clarity. It reveals the seam where narrative and dataset diverge. That seam is small, but it is enough. It marks the point at which the mind can slow down and notice its own patterns with greater precision than the system that tracks them. It allows identity to be shaped again by contact rather than prediction. The self regains a texture that cannot be fully captured. In that texture, the story that the world cannot compute begins to return. Politics now feels less like a disagreement over facts and more like a struggle to decide which storyline the moment belongs to. Each group carries its own frame of meaning, its own emotional palette, its own sense of danger and hope. These frames do not interpret events so much as dictate what events are allowed to mean. A single occurrence can look like renewal to one person, decline to another, and infiltration to someone else. The tension does not arise from differing opinions. It arises because the underlying structures that grant things meaning no longer overlap. This fracture becomes tangible in the smallest encounters. Two people read the same headline and walk away with opposite impressions because the headline does not enter a shared interpretive field. It lands inside architectures shaped by long streams of narrative that the other person has never seen. A conversation that once would have unfolded with natural ease now requires careful footing. A gesture that seems neutral to one person feels like an alignment with an entire worldview to another. The social world becomes more difficult to navigate, not because people have changed, but because the maps guiding them no longer match. The disconnect produces a quiet strain that threads through workplaces, homes, friendships, even silence. This tension carries a physical feel, a pause before speaking, a subtle tightening in the shoulders when a topic shifts, a hesitated breath while assessing whether a comment will be heard in its intended sense, or interpreted as allegiance to a narrative one does not inhabit. These small moments accumulate. They reveal how fragile the shared space of understanding has become. People are not just disagreeing, they are inhabiting different structures of meaning, and the effort required to bridge them becomes a form of labour that leaves the mind fatigued. The ethical consequences of this divide reach far beyond discomfort. When groups live inside incompatible maps, the capacity for collective reasoning weakens. Institutions that once appeared stable begin to lose their coherence because legitimacy itself is interpreted differently, depending on the map used to evaluate it. Public life becomes a negotiation not of competing interests, but of competing realities. This produces a dangerous drift. When people cannot agree on what the terrain looks like, they cannot coordinate solutions, recognize shared harm, or build the trust necessary for social stability. The fracture becomes self-reinforcing. Each map confirms itself by filtering out what contradicts it, deepening the divide that gave rise to it. Yet, even in this fragmentation, a small possibility remains. The maps are not wrong because they differ. They are incomplete because they attempt to totalize a world that is too complex for any single frame to contain. Recognizing this does not erase disagreement, it softens its edges. It allows a person to step back from the demand that their map define the terrain for everyone else. That step creates a slight opening, a moment where interpretation loosens, where another person's frame can be seen without needing to be replaced. The opening is small, but it is enough to remind the mind that the world does not need to be held by one map alone. Meaning begins to thin when the world arrives faster than the mind can give it shape. What once unfolded as a sequence now comes as a scatter of claims, images, urgencies and reversals that refuse to settle into anything coherent. A headline contradicts the one before it. A crisis dissolves before comprehension forms. A certainty becomes provisional within minutes. The mind tries to weave these fragments into a stable picture, but coherence requires time, and time has been replaced by a perpetual present that demands instant interpretation. The exhaustion that follows is not simply cognitive, it is structural. Meaning cannot survive at the speed it is now required to form. This breakdown reveals itself in moments so small they are easy to overlook. At the end of a long day, the eyes glide over a sentence twice, neither pass bringing understanding. The chest tightens with a pressure that is not quite fear, but something closer to saturation. The mind feels heavy, as though submerged in a medium too dense for thought to move freely. There is a sensation of trying to grasp a shape that dissolves each time a new signal appears. Even memory becomes unstable. Events blur together because the pace of arrival prevents the rhythms that help memory anchor itself. The world becomes harder to hold, not because attention is weak, but because the structure of input is incompatible with the rhythms of human interpretation. Emotion strains under this mismatch. A person hesitates before trusting their own impression, unsure whether they have misread the moment or whether the moment has changed again in the time it took to think about it. Confidence erodes quietly. Judgments feel provisional. Even simple decisions carry a faint sense of instability. This is not indecision in the usual sense. It is the erosion of the internal scaffolding that makes decisions feel grounded. The self begins to skim experience rather than absorb it, treating everything as temporary because nothing stays long enough to be integrated. What looks like apathy is often a form of protection, a way to survive conditions that demand more meaning-making than the mind can supply. The ethical cost of this collapse is sharper than it appears. When meaning becomes volatile, agency becomes fragile. It becomes harder to discern what deserves action and what has simply been engineered to provoke a response. The line between significance and stimulation blurs. This makes individuals vulnerable to narratives that promise coherence, even if they distort the truth. Simplified stories become attractive, not because they are accurate, but because they restore a sense of stability. In environments where sense-making is strained, certainty becomes a seductive substitute for clarity. This is how meaning collapse becomes a political and social risk, not merely a personal burden. Yet within the exhaustion lies a turning point. When the mind can no longer hold the world at global scale, attention naturally contracts to a size it can sustain. A conversation, a concrete task, a room with its own steady rhythm. In these smaller spaces, coherence reappears because the pace matches the capacity of perception. This contraction is not retreat, it is recalibration. It acknowledges that truth requires a scale at which interpretation can stabilize. When attention returns to what can be lived rather than merely received, meaning begins to gather again quietly in forms the mind can finally hold. When the world becomes too large to hold, attention instinctively contracts to the smallest place where reality still feels solid. This contraction does not begin as a choice. It arises from the body, from the need for a scale of experience that does not fracture under the speed of global noise. A kitchen table with its familiar grain, the steady rhythm of footsteps on a path, a conversation in which the pauses feel natural rather than strategic. These small zones of presence do not simplify the world. They return it to a size that perception can inhabit without distortion. The global continues its frantic churn somewhere beyond reach, but the mind begins to reorganize itself around the textures that can be verified through direct contact. Within these smaller spaces, detail regains its weight. The way a neighbour's shoulders carry fatigue says more about economic pressure than many headlines. The uneven pace of foot traffic on a street reveals shifts that statistics only echo at a distance. Even the sound of a kettle settling after boiling carries a grounded rhythm that no feed can supply. These sensations remind the mind that understanding begins not with scale but with contact. They restore the ability to interpret events at a pace aligned with lived time rather than accelerated signals. The world thickens again through what is immediate, not because it is simpler, but because it is present enough for meaning to take shape. This return to the local reveals something that the global story conceals. Most forms of meaning are produced at scales too small for platforms to capture. Care emerges between people who can look at each other directly. Responsibility grows from attention offered to what is at hand rather than what is infinitely distant. Even tension held in person feels different. It becomes a negotiation shaped by tone and presence rather than an abstract clash of narratives. These small interactions form the fabric that allows a society to withstand disruption. At global scale, attention is extracted. At local scale, attention becomes reciprocal. The global encourages abstraction. The local demands recognition. The global overwhelms agency by expanding the field of concern beyond what can be acted upon. The local restores agency by connecting action to consequence. This does not mean abandoning awareness of the larger world. It means grounding awareness in a scale where interpretation and action can align. The return to the local is not a retreat from complexity. It is the re-establishment of conditions in which complexity can be met without collapse. Silence returns first as a slight unfamiliarity in the air, a soft widening of space around thought. The reflex to reach for the device still rises, but without the usual urgency. The mind anticipates the next stimulus, then finds none waiting, and in that gap, a different kind of awareness begins to surface. This is not the silence of retreat or avoidance. It is the silence that appears when the machinery of narrative loosens, when the constant demand to frame, interpret, and respond finally pauses. Without the pressure to produce meaning, perception regains the ability to register what is actually present rather than what must be understood. The body feels this shift before the mind does. Shoulders settle without instruction. The breath deepens on its own. The eyes linger on a surface for a fraction of a second longer than usual, long enough for texture to replace interpretation. A sound in the room becomes distinct in a way it has not been for months. Even stillness takes on a density that feels unfamiliar. These small sensations remind the mind that experience does not need to be converted into language to matter. In their presence, the habitual impulse to narrate weakens. A moment does not immediately become a scene. A feeling does not instantly become a claim. The world begins to meet you without needing to be explained. As the quiet expands, the internal narrator reveals its habitual movements. You notice the reflex to summarize even a simple moment, to shape it into something legible for an imagined audience. You notice the subtle pull toward coherence, the urge to connect this moment to the next and give it the arc of a story. In silence, these impulses become visible rather than automatic. They appear as movements of the mind rather than as truths about reality. This visibility is not an end in itself. It is a form of freedom. When the mind can see its own narrative reflexes, it is no longer entirely shaped by them. The ethical force of silence becomes clear only after this recognition. By withholding narration even briefly, you interrupt the cycle that turns attention into material for consumption. You refuse the expectation that every moment should be meaningful in a public or performative way. This refusal is subtle but real. It restores a form of autonomy that cannot be extracted by systems designed to anticipate and steer perception. It allows experience to exist on its own terms rather than being shaped for legibility. Over time, silence changes the internal landscape. Thoughts form at their natural pace. Sensations arrive without immediately being categorized. The self no longer needs to perform coherence. It can inhabit the moment without shaping it into a narrative. In this stillness, reality becomes audible again, not as a story, but as something lived before language.